Night had settled heavily over the Ngoloko highlands, draping the land in a silence so profound that even the wind dared not disturb it. The dense foliage swayed gently, whispering secrets of forgotten times, as if the very earth remembered stories that no human tongue had spoken in centuries. In the dim glow of the torches, shadows stretched unnaturally against the towering cliffs, their jagged edges cutting into the night like the teeth of an unseen beast. Odissa moved cautiously, his boots sinking into the damp soil with each step, the weight of his decision pressing on him like an unseen hand on his shoulder. Behind him, this team, 3 men and 1 woman, all hardened by years of exploration, followed with uneasy steps. Their breaths were shallow, their fingers twitching slightly over their gear. They had explored ruins swallowed by deserts, uncovered relics buried beneath forgotten temples. But this place, this cave, was different. The villagers had spoken in hushed voices, their expressions laced with a fear that felt far too real to be dismissed as mere superstition. The elder Mwando had been the most direct. No one enters Bantugwa and returns the same. Some do not return at all. His words had lingered in Odissa's mind like an echo refusing to fade. Yet here they were. As they crossed the threshold of the cave's mouth, an eerie chill crept over them. The air inside was dense, thick with an almost tangible pressure, as though the very walls were closing in, watching. Their torches flickered violently, their flames dancing in a silent warning. The deeper they went, the more the world outside seemed to disappear, swallowed by the ever-expanding darkness. Then they saw them, carvings, ancient, precise, etched into the stone with unnatural skill. Figures stood in rigid lines, their elongated bodies marked with symbols that none of them recognized. But it wasn't the carvings themselves that sent a shiver through Odissa's spine. It was their eyes. Even in the dim torchlight, the eyes of the figures gleamed. A soft, eerie glow radiated from the stone, as if some unseen force still lingered within. "This isn't natural," one of the explorers muttered under his breath, his voice barely above a whisper. Odissa took a deep breath, forcing himself to remain steady. His heart pounded, but it wasn't fear, it was something else, something deeper, something calling. A sound broke the silence. A whisper, a sigh, a distant breath. The group froze. The sound was faint, almost imperceptible, but it was there. Something in the darkness breathed. A sudden gust of wind surged through the cavern, though there was no source for it. Their torches flickered wildly, shadows dancing like restless spirits against the walls. And then, a low hum filled the air, vibrating through the stone, through their bones, sinking into the marrow of their being. And then they saw it. At first, it was just a shape, barely distinguishable against the abyssal blackness of the cave's depths. A small figure, sitting perfectly still, as if it had always been there, waiting. Odissa's pulse thundered in his ears. He stepped forward, cautiously lifting his torch. The flickering light revealed more details, skin dark as the night itself, smooth and untouched by time. And then, as the shadows shifted, the eyes became visible. Not human, not normal, glowing, a golden hue, soft yet piercing, pulsing as if filled with life, shifting like embers struggling to reignite. The child's face was expressionless, unmoving, but the eyes watched them. Every muscle in Odissa's body tensed. The others held their breath, waiting for the boy to move, to speak, to blink something. But he did none of those things. He simply sat, his radiant gaze locked onto them, silent and still, as if the very act of existing in this place required no effort at all. One of the explorers, Django, took an involuntary step back. This isn't right." His voice was barely above a whisper, his words shaking. "No child survives in a place like this." And he was right. Bantugwa was deep, untouched, a tomb of silence where no living thing thrived. No food, no water, no light, and yet here he was, a child who should not be. Odissa took a slow step forward, his mind racing with possibilities. Was this boy abandoned? Trapped? Or something else entirely? His instincts screamed at him to turn back, to leave whatever this was undisturbed. But he couldn't, because deep in his gut, something told him that this boy was the reason they had come here in the first place. The others didn't move. The tension in the air was suffocating, thick like smoke. The flickering torchlight danced in the boy's golden eyes, but he did not blink. Finally, Odysseus spoke. His voice was careful, deliberate. "What is your name?" The silence stretched unbearably. A moment passed, then another, and then a whisper, so soft, so fragile, like a memory lost in the wind. Zubiri. The name sent a shiver through Odysseus' spine. The old tongue. It meant strong as iron. Something about that name felt important, as if it carried a weight far beyond its letters, as if it had been spoken long before this moment, and would be spoken long after. Odysseus' throat tightened. "Zubiri, how did you get here?" The boy tilted his head slightly, considering the question. Then slowly his lips parted. But before he could speak, the ground trembled. A deep, guttural sound rumbled through the cavern. A noise that came from everywhere and nowhere all at once. The walls shook, dust and small stones cascading from the ceiling. The hum from earlier returned, only now it was louder, vibrating inside their chests. And then, Zubiri's eyes glowed brighter. A golden flare, surging like a heartbeat, illuminating the darkness in pulses of unnatural light. The team staggered back, their bodies riddled with a primal, unshakable fear. And in that moment, Odysseus understood. This child was not lost. This child was waiting. And they had just awakened something that had been asleep for far too long. Odysseus' breath was slow, measured, but his heart pounded like the echo of a distant drum, a rhythm he could not control. His fingers twitched slightly as he stepped forward, drawn by something he did not understand. The boy sat unmoving, his glowing eyes locked onto him with an intensity that felt almost unbearable. The torchlight flickered across the damp cavern walls, but its glow was weak compared to the unnatural radiance pulsing from the child's gaze. It was not merely light, it was something alive, something aware. And yet, the boy did not speak, did not blink, did not shift in the slightest. He was simply there. The silence pressed in, thick and suffocating. Behind Odysseus, the others hesitated, their discomfort evident in the way their bodies stiffened, the way their hands instinctively moved toward the weapons strapped to their sides. The presence of the child, though small, felt immense. There was no sound but the distant dripping of water from the cavern ceiling, the quiet crackling of their torches, and the low hum. The hum that had been there from the moment they'd stepped into this place, vibrating in their bones like a sound just beyond the reach of hearing. Odysseus knelt slowly, his movements careful, deliberate. He needed to see the boy up close, needed to understand. His mind raced with questions, each one louder than the last. Who was this child? Why was he here? And, most disturbingly, why did it feel as though he had been waiting for them? His voice was steady, though a strange unease crawled up his spine. "What's your name?" The words hung in the air, fragile, as if the cave itself was holding its breath, waiting. For a long, stretching moment, there was no reply. The boy's face remained unreadable, his expression neither fearful nor curious. Just still, the silence deepened, and something about it made Odysseus' pulse quicken. It wasn't just silence. It was the absence of something, like a void where there should have been sound. Then a whisper, so faint it almost wasn't real. "Zubiri." The name sent a shiver through Odysseus' chest. It was old, a name that carried weight, a name with roots that stretched deeper than the earth beneath them. In the ancient tongue of the ancestors, it meant strong as iron. A name not given lightly, a name meant for someone with a purpose. Odysseus' fingers curled slightly against the cool stone beneath him. He had spent years uncovering the past, translating the forgotten words of long-dead civilizations. But this felt different. This was not just history. This was something alive, something reaching through time itself. Behind him, Jingo shifted uneasily. "We need to go," he murmured, voice tight with something dangerously close to fear. "We shouldn't be here." Another voice, tense. This isn't normal. A child alone, deep in a cave like this? It's not possible. Odessa knew they were right. Every rational thought screamed that they should turn back, that they should leave this boy where they found him. And yet, he couldn't. Because deep in his chest, beneath the fear, beneath the confusion, something pulled him closer. Zuberi was barely clothed, his frame thin, yet there was no sign of frailty in him. No trembling from the cold, no exhaustion, no signs of hunger. His posture was perfectly still, his breathing so even that it seemed unnatural. And yet, despite his eerie stillness, his eyes held something familiar. Recognition, understanding. Odessa frowned. "You know me, don't you?" Zuberi blinked once. Not an answer, but not a denial. A slow exhale escaped Odessa's lips. A strange feeling twisted inside him, as if this moment had already happened before, as if he were merely following a path that had been laid long ago. Was that even possible? Another murmur of protest rose behind him. "Odessa, we should leave him. We don't know what this is." But Odessa barely heard them. His focus was locked onto Zuberi, onto the quiet power behind those golden eyes. He had met countless people in his travels, scholars, warriors, elders whose wisdom stretched beyond a single lifetime. But he had never felt this before. This wasn't just a child. Zuberi was something more. And Odessa knew, with an unshakable certainty, that he was the reason they had come here. The maps, the research, the stories, the whispers of something waiting in the darkness. All of it had led to this very moment. The boy had been waiting. But for what? For them? For him? Odessa's pulse pounded against his ribs. He should have been afraid. Any rational person would have been. But instead, he felt something else. Something far more dangerous than fear. Curiosity. Zuberi was a mystery. And Odessa had never been able to walk away from a mystery. Odessa took a slow, steady breath, his pulse hammering against his ribs. His fingers tightened around Zuberi's small wrist, the boy's skin unnaturally cool against his own. The others lingered behind, their steps hesitant, their gazes flickering between the child and the suffocating darkness around them. No one dared to speak. No one dared to breathe too deeply, as if the very air carried a warning. The cave felt different now. Awake, aware, watching. Jingo's voice came in a low murmur, barely above the weight of his own fear. "We shouldn't have come." His hand hovered near the hilt of his blade, though what steel could do against whatever force lurked in this cavern was a question he dared not answer. This place was sealed for a reason. "We need to leave. Now." Odessa agreed. Every instinct screamed at him to turn back, to leave this strange boy behind and escape the clutches of whatever unseen thing had bound itself to these ancient stones. And yet he couldn't. He had found the boy, or rather, the boy had found him. A force deeper than logic, older than fear, told him that leaving Zuberi behind was not an option. With a slow nod, Odessa tugged the child's wrist gently. "Come with me, Zuberi. We're leaving." His voice was firm, steady, but the flickering torchlight did little to disguise the tension coiling in his chest. Zuberi neither resisted nor followed immediately. Instead, his glowing golden eyes lingered on Odessa, searching, considering. And then, in a movement so fluid it barely seemed human, the boy rose to his feet, silent, unshaken, unafraid. That was when it happened. The cave trembled. A deep, guttural vibration rippled through the walls, shaking loose centuries of dust, sending small stones skittering across the floor. The torches flickered violently, the flames bending unnaturally, as though drawn towards something unseen. The very air thickened, pressing against their skin, heavy with a charge that made the hairs on Odessa's arms stand on end. Then, the hum returned, low at first, subtle, a vibration just beyond hearing, one that settled in the marrow of their bones. But it grew, louder, stronger, a pressure building, pressing against their skulls, their lungs. The torches fought for life, their flames dimmed, swallowed by the darkness that now felt alive. A gust of wind, impossible for they were deep underground, whipped through the cavern, carrying with it something else. A voice. It did not come from one direction. It came from everywhere and nowhere all at once. Neither male nor female, neither young nor old. It was ancient, layered, woven from whispers and echoes. And yet, though no language should have been recognizable, the words clawed their way into their minds, understood as if they had always known them. The child does not belong to the world of men. A breath caught in Odysseus' throat. Jingo cursed under his breath. Another explorer stumbled backward, fingers trembling over his necklace, lips moving in silent prayer. The voice had no face, no body, but its presence filled the cavern. It wrapped around them like an unseen hand, curling its fingers against their flesh, their minds. Zubiri did not move, did not flinch. Odysseus exhaled sharply, his grip on the boy tightening. "He's coming with me." No response, only the hum, growing louder, vibrating inside their skulls. Jingo took a step back, sweat glistening on his brow. "Odysseus, we need to run." And then shadows moved. From the far end of the cave, something shifted. Not an object, not a creature, the darkness itself. It rippled, twisted, pulled itself away from the walls like ink bleeding through stone. No eyes, no limbs, only formless blackness, reaching, stretching, drawn toward the boy. Fear clawed its way up Odysseus' spine, but he did not let go. He took a step, then another. Zubiri followed, his steps silent, unhurried, as if he had already seen the outcome of this moment long before it arrived. The moment Odysseus crossed a threshold, the ground shook violently. A deafening crack split the air as stone fractured behind them. The way back, collapsing. "Move!" someone shouted. They ran. The cave roared around them, stones splitting, the shadows behind them slithering closer, faster, unnatural in their movements. The passage ahead twisted and turned, their torches barely lighting the way. The weight of the air fought against them, every step harder, every breath heavier. And yet, Odysseus did not let go. He dragged Zubiri forward, his grip ironclad, his feet pounding against uneven rock. The walls trembled, dust clouding the air, the hum still vibrating deep within them. His lungs burned, his muscles screamed, but he did not stop. Zubiri's golden eyes flickered, just for a second, dimmed. The air shifted, the pressure around them lifted, just slightly. The unseen force holding them back weakened. Odysseus saw the opening ahead, the entrance so close. One final push, one final step, and then silence. The moment they crossed the threshold, the weight vanished. The hum stopped, the trembling ceased. The air outside was cold against Odysseus' skin, crisp, fresh, real. He turned back, breathless. The cave stood silent, undisturbed. No shadows, no voice, no evidence of the terror that had nearly swallowed them whole. Only darkness, only mystery, only a quiet whisper that clung to the air, a warning unspoken. Odysseus loosened his grip. Zubiri stood beside him. The glow in his golden eyes had faded to mere embers. And yet, Odysseus knew this was far from over. The village of Kalongo lay beneath the vast African sky, its thatched roofs and winding paths illuminated only by the flickering glow of lanterns and the cold, distant light of the moon. A wind, slow but relentless, moved through the trees, carrying with it whispers of the past, voices lost to time. The land was old, and it remembered things that man had long tried to forget. Odysseus walked with measured steps, his mind heavy with unanswered questions. Zubiri followed beside him, silent as ever, his presence both unsettling and strangely familiar. The child had not spoken since they left the cave. Not a single word, not a single question. He moved as though guided by something unseen, as though he knew the path before them better than Odysseus himself. The villagers watched from the shadows, their eyes filled with fear, their whispers hushed but urgent. The elders had warned them. The cave of Bantugwa was not a place of man. And now, Odysseus had returned with something that should not have been found. He did not stop to explain. He did not yet have the words. There was only one man in Kalongo who might have the answers he needed. Edendwundal. The old man sat near the sacred tree at the heart of the village, where only the wise and the weary came to speak of things that should not be spoken. His robes, woven from the fibers of time itself, carried the scent of the earth after rain. His face was lined with the weight of countless years, his eyes deep and knowing. When Adissa approached, Mwando lifted his gaze, but it was not Adissa he was looking at. It was Ziburi. For a long moment, the elder did nothing. His breathing slowed, his fingers tracing unseen patterns into the worn wood of his staff. Then finally he spoke. "This is not a child." The words sent a shiver through Adissa's spine. He swallowed, his throat suddenly dry. "What do you mean?" Mwando's gaze did not waver. His eyes, clouded with memory, seemed to look beyond the present, beyond the village, beyond even the world itself. He let out a slow breath, his voice barely above a whisper. "Long ago, there was a time of darkness, a time when the land bled and the sky wept, a time when things that should never have been walked freely among men." His grip tightened around his staff. The elders of the old world, the true keepers of this land, gathered and did what had to be done. They sealed it away, a power too dangerous, too great for man to wield, a power that did not belong to this world. Adissa felt a cold weight settle in his chest. And what does that have to do with him? Mwando turned his gaze back to Ziburi. The boy stood still, unmoving, his golden eyes unreadable. Listening, the boy, Mwando murmured, is a fragment of that power, a sliver of something that should never have returned. He is neither here nor there, neither fully human nor fully other. He is trapped between worlds. Adissa's fingers curled into fists. His pulse was loud in his ears, pounding like distant war drums. He had spent his life searching for lost histories, for truths buried beneath the weight of time. But this was something else entirely. Mwando continued, his voice now tinged with something Adissa could not name. If his eyes glow again, it means the seal is breaking. It means the darkness that was locked away is waking. A sudden wind howled through the village, rattling the wooden structures, making the flames of the lanterns tremble. The sky, once calm, now carried a strange heaviness. A shadow passed over the moon, dimming its light for just a moment, long enough for the air to turn cold. Adissa felt it deep in his bones. Something was coming. His jaw tightened as he turned to Ziburi. The boy's expression had not changed. He did not tremble. He did not show fear. Instead, for the first time since leaving the cave, he lifted his head and looked up at the sky, as if seeing something that no one else could. And then he spoke. His voice was clear. "Strong. They're coming." The words were not a warning. They were a fact. That night, the sky split apart. It did not tear with the violence of thunder nor the rage of a storm, but with a silence so deep it felt unnatural. A crack of nothingness, a void stretching across the heavens, devouring the stars. The air itself shuddered, growing thick, wrong, as if the world had been tilted ever so slightly, just enough for the rules of nature to no longer apply. Then they came. Dark figures rose from the horizon, emerging not from the land, nor from the sky, but from the very fabric of the night itself. They shifted, flickered, their shapes never fully formed, never fully still. Their bodies, if they could be called that, were not made of flesh or bone, but of shadows that refused to be tamed by the light. They moved unnaturally, their presence pressing against the senses, sending a ripple of terror through the villagers. A scream shattered the air, then another. Mothers pulled their children into their homes, doors slamming shut, hands gripping talismans, whispered prayers spilling from trembling lips. The elders stood frozen, their worst fears manifesting before their eyes. Kalongo had seen many horrors, but never this. Never the return of something that should have remained buried beneath time itself. But Adissa did not move. His feet remained planted in the dry earth, his hands clenched into fists. He could feel it, the pull, the weight, the presence of something greater than himself pressing down upon him. This was not an attack of man, nor beasts. This was something else. His voice was steady, though his breath felt shallow. What did they want? Zuberi turned to him. His expression had not changed. There was no fear in his golden eyes, no surprise, only understanding. They want me. The words settled in Odysseus' chest like iron, heavy and unmoving, a truth so simple, yet so deeply wrong. His jaw tightened, his muscles coiled. He knew what had to be done. Then they will have to go through me first. The figures lunged forward, their forms stretched, lengthened, tendrils of darkness reaching, grasping, pulling toward the boy. The ground beneath them withered where they touched, as if their very presence drained the life from the earth. The lanterns that still burned flickered, their flames shrinking in protest, struggling to hold on to their existence. The weight of the night grew unbearable. Odysseus moved without thinking. His instincts screamed, his body tensed, but before he could react, Zuberi stepped forward. For the first time, the boy moved of his own accord. He did not run, did not flinch, did not hesitate. He raised his hands, and then his eyes ignited. The glow that had once been a soft ember blazed in a fire, golden and unyielding. The night recoiled from his gaze, and for the first time, the shadows hesitated. Zuberi did not blink, did not falter. His lips parted, and from deep within him, a word was spoken. A word older than time. A word not meant to be remembered. A word that was not heard with ears, but felt in the bones, in the soul, in the very essence of existence. The moment it was uttered, the figure shattered, like glass meeting stone, like mist caught in the morning sun. The darkness that had threatened to consume them collapsed in on itself, breaking apart into nothingness, dissolving as if it had never been. The air that had been suffocating just seconds before turned still, empty, hollow, and then silence. A silence that stretched too long, too unnatural, too final. The village stood frozen. The night, just moments ago alive with terror, had been swallowed by an eerie calm. No wind, no whispers, no remnants of what had just transpired. Only dust settling, only the faint sound of a single heartbeat. Odysseus slowly unclenched his fists. His breath, ragged and uneven, fought to return to him. He turned, searching for the boy, for an answer, for something, anything, that would make sense of what had just occurred. Zuberi stood at the center of it all, his hands lowered, his golden eyes now dim to embers once more. His face remained unreadable, unchanged. The nightmare had ended. But at what cost? The village of Kalongo lay still beneath the endless sky, the echoes of battle lingering in the silence. The air was thick with the weight of what had just transpired, with the remnants of something beyond human comprehension. The lanterns, flickering weakly, barely illuminated the earth where shadows had once crawled. The people, still hidden within their homes, whispered in hushed voices, afraid to speak too loudly, as if acknowledging what had happened might summon it back. Odysseus stood motionless, his breath unsteady, his hands trembling at his sides. His body still carried the adrenaline of battle, the fight or flight instinct still lingering in his veins. But there was nothing left to fight, nothing left to fear, only the emptiness of the night, the quiet hum of the wind, and the boy who stood at the center of it all. He turned to Zuberi, and in that moment he knew. The boy was changing. The glow in Zuberi's golden eyes, once fierce enough to split the night apart, was fading. The embers were dying. His form, once solid and steady, now flickered at the edges, his silhouette blurring as though he were nothing more than a mirage. The wind passed through him differently, stirring his presence like mist touched by morning light. Odysseus' chest tightened. No, this wasn't right. Zuberi, his voice was rough, urgent, but the boy only turned to him with a quiet expression, one that carried no fear, no sorrow, only peace. I'm free now. Zuberi's voice was soft, light, carrying the weight of 1,000 untold stories, of secrets buried beneath time itself. The seal is restored. The darkness will not return. Odysseus took a step forward, his fingers curling into fists. His mind fought against reality, against what he knew was happening. This wasn't how it was supposed to be. He had saved Zuberi, had fought for him, had protected him. He had done everything he could to keep him here. So why was he disappearing? His voice cracked. But what happens to you? For the first time, Zuberi smiled. A small, knowing smile. A smile full of gratitude, of understanding, of something almost human, yet not. It was the kind of expression that belonged to someone who had always known how this would end. I was never meant to stay. The words hit Adisa like a blade to the chest. His pulse thundered in his ears, his breath shallow. He had known, somewhere deep inside, in the quiet parts of his mind, he had always known that Zuberi was something different, something borrowed, something that was never meant to be here. And yet, it didn't make it any easier to accept. Zuberi took one last breath, a breath that did not disturb the air, that did not carry weight, that was barely even there at all. He turned his golden eyes to Adisa one last time, and his voice, barely above a whisper, carried the weight of a farewell that had been waiting for centuries. But thank you for giving me a name. The final words hung in the air, suspended between existence and nothingness. And then, he was gone, not in a flash of light, not in a gust of wind, not with any grand display of magic or power. He simply faded, like mist dissolving in the sun, like a forgotten dream slipping away upon waking. 1 second he was there, the next he was nothing but a shimmer in the night, a memory carried by the wind. Adisa stood rooted in place, his hands still reaching for something that was no longer there. His heartbeat was the only sound he could hear. The village was silent. The people, the land, the sky, all bore witness to something beyond their comprehension. They had seen darkness rise, had felt its presence, had trembled before its return. And now, they had seen it fall. The wind stirred. It moved differently now, softer, lighter. The weight that had pressed upon the village, the unseen force that had coiled itself around the land for centuries, was gone. And then the whisper came. It did not come from the villagers, not from the wind, not from Adisa's own thoughts. It came from everywhere and nowhere all at once. A voice, so faint, so distant, yet impossibly clear. Zuberi. It did not belong to the boy. It belonged to something older, something watching, something remembering. Adisa closed his eyes, and for the first time, he understood. Zuberi had never just meant strong as iron. It had meant something else entirely, strong enough to set a lost soul free. If you enjoyed this video, please help us grow by subscribing to this humble channel. And if you'd like to watch more videos like this, we prepared the next video especially for you. Click here to watch.